Good afternoon, hello, and welcome to this ISP event webinar on From One War to Another, Moscow and the Middle East. Welcome to our speakers and to our audience as well. Why is it important to talk about Russia-Middle East relations now, in this very moment? I think for two main reasons. First, last Saturday marked the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and since the onset of the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, the country's role and presence in the Middle East and North Africa region has undergone a notable shift, both in terms of diplomacy and in terms of Russia's military presence and engagement, and also economically. Russia, being increasingly marginalized by Western countries, has engaged more deeply with many countries of the MENA region. The cooperation with Iran, for instance, stands out as a clear example of this, but also cooperation with countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and many others. And of course, this has not been a unilateral trajectory. On the other side, MENA countries not only have not condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, but they have been more than open to welcome collaborations of any kind with Russia. Economic collaborations, military collaborations. We will touch upon a lot of these, all of these aspects with our speakers today. TOBIAS, BORCK, and now I will introduce our speakers. We have co-authored a policy paper published by ISP a couple of months ago. When was it? I don't remember. 2-3 months ago, where we explored these mutual relationships, and we talked about. We refer to them as forms of strategic codependence. To be fair, the definition was not ours, Tobias. It was a definition of Professor Mark Katz, but we elaborated on it. So now, 2 years after the beginning of the Ukraine invasion, it is important to assess what Russia is up to in the Middle East and North Africa. And the other reason why today's event is particularly timely, I believe, is that tomorrow, as you know, from February 29 to March 2, Russia invited 14 organizations to a sort of intra-Palestinian meeting to be held in Moscow. Among the attendees will be representatives of, probably, we still don't know who effectively will attend, but they are expected to attend representatives from Fatah, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and other groups, many groups, Palestinian political forces operating in different Middle Eastern countries, especially Syria and Lebanon. Moscow's motivation for hosting such a meeting, as Bogdanov, the Russia Middle East envoy, explained, is to help Palestinian forces agree to unite politically, but clearly there are also other motivations. International motivations. The ongoing conflict in Gaza clearly serves as yet another theater where Moscow's regional ambitions come into play, and also there are internal motivations, probably. What Putin may be interested in staging is also a sort of positive story, a positive narrative for his internal audience, a domestic audience, to sort of spice up his upcoming re-election. So many topics and many things to discuss, and I'm happy to do that with really excellent scholars and experts of Russia and the Middle East, and friends as well. So let me introduce our speakers in alphabetical order. So Tobias BORCK, who's now Senior Associate Fellow, at the Royal United Services Institute in London, the RUSI. Welcome, Tobias. NIKOLAY, KOZHANOV, Research Associate Professor at the Gulf Study Center of the Qatar University. Welcome, NIKOLAY. And last but not least, HANNA NOTTE, who's the Director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and Senior Associate Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the CSIS in DC. Welcome, Anna. So Very quickly, before starting, let me remind that there is a possibility for our audience to ask Q&A via the chat function on our platform. And so after a few rounds of questions to our speakers, I will open up the debate with the audience, and I will convey your questions to our guests. Hanna, let me start with you. We are saying 2 years after the start of the invasion of Ukraine, very broad question, but what is Russia up to in the MENA? Can we say that the MENA countries, perhaps most particularly the Middle East region, have become more important for Russia in the aftermath of its invasion of Ukraine? If yes, how and why? And I should ask you to focus perhaps on more geopolitical aspects, as we would touch on geopolitical aspects more in detail with NIKOLAY. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Chiara, and thank you so much for the invitation to ISPI. It's a great pleasure to join you today. So let me try to zoom out a little bit here. Yes, I do believe that the MENA region has become more important to Russia in light of the war against Ukraine, if anything, for the simple reason that we've seen this deep and harsh decoupling by Russia from the West. And I think there's a calculation in Moscow that this decoupling is for good, that there's no way back to relations with the West as they were before the war. So non-Western regions have become more important for Russian foreign policy. I would argue that Russia's core interests in the Middle East, in the security domain, economic interests, the interest of being involved in regional mediation, by and large, those interests have not changed. They remain the same. What has changed for Moscow is perhaps some of the tools or the means that Russia has to exert influence. We've seen that the Russians have faced some constraints. We know that in Syria, they perhaps handed some bases to Iran-backed forces early into the war. They certainly have some constraints in terms of military bandwidth. They cannot easily scale up their presence in the region from where it is today, because the demands of the campaign in Ukraine remain quite significant for Russia. But Russia has found ways to maintain and solidify its presence in the Middle East. In Syria, I would argue it's been a mixture of working together with the Iranians on the ground, but also pushing forward normalization between the Assad government and the League of Arab States on the one hand. Turkey, that's an ongoing process, because I think Russia wants regional countries to step in with reconstruction funding and investment for Syria. And they have even signaled an interest in a deep water port in Libya, and have been trying to officialize their presence in Libya. So certainly in terms of a military presence in the MENA region, I don't think that Russia is going anywhere. But let me just zoom out and make a geopolitical argument that I think is kind of decisive for understanding where Russia is in the MENA region today. Now, I would argue that confrontation with the West over Ukraine has become the organizing principle of Russian foreign policy today, and it now shapes Russia's entire approach to the Middle East. And that wasn't the case before February 2022. Let me give you 3 quick examples where we see this playing out, this confrontation with the West dictating Russia's approach to the region. The first example, I think, is Syria, where the Russians have been more brazen, pushing back against the US presence in the northeast of the country, but also ending their support on the UN Security Council last summer for cross-border humanitarian aid into Idlib. That's one example. The second example is Russia's posturing on the Iran nuclear dossier, where prior to the war in Ukraine, Russia was a partner for Western countries in efforts to restore the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. I think that has fallen by the wayside against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine. Russia has become less interested in seeing those efforts succeed. Against a deepening of the Russia-Iran relationship, I think Russia has become more defensive of the Iranians, less willing to exert leverage over them. I think you could even go as far as arguing that Russia right now has more generally deprioritized nuclear nonproliferation, again, in this broader context of confrontation with the West. And the third, I think, prime example where you see confrontation with the West dictating Moscow's approach to the region is in the events since October 7th and Hamas's attack on Israel. Russia has adopted a very pro-Palestinian position on the conflict. And I suppose we'll talk a little bit more about this. But I think even if you accept that there has been historically an affinity for the Palestinian cause, I think there was much more of an effort to balance between Israel and the Palestinians prior to October 7th. That has fallen by the wayside because I think Moscow quite instrumentally wants to tap into grievances over the Palestinian issue and Israel's military campaign in Gaza, in order to tap into perceptions of Western double standards with regards to Ukraine and Gaza that I think are quite widespread, not just in the Middle East, but in the broader global South. Perhaps let me end here with this sort of broad overview of where we stand, and happy to hear the others.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. Very much agree with this idea that confrontation with the West is one guiding principle of Russia's policy in the MENA. I'm not sure that Syria does make a very good example, though, to my eyes, at least Syria has always been more into the Russian sphere of influence than other countries. So it's like they have the bigger end, have been having the bigger hand for a long time in that country. But maybe we can discuss this later on. Nikolay, over to you. So Hanna made a very good introduction of what are the geopolitical motives driving Russia in the Middle East right now. Can you please focus maybe a bit more on the economic motivations behind Russia's engagement in the MENA recently, over the past 2 years post-invasion, please.
Thank you very much for the question, Kara. Definitely, I would like to agree with Hanna that interestingly, this war didn't become a game changer, but rather it served as a catalyst for Russia's relations with the Middle East. And it is especially obvious when we are touching the question of Russia's economic relations with the region. Even before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the region mattered for Moscow from many aspects. First and foremost, Russia was looking into this region as an opportunity for investments. If we're talking about the Gulf, Russia was looking for greater cooperation and coordination in terms of the oil market regulation within the framework of OPEC and OPEC Plus, and for sure not the last role in the interaction between Russia and the cartel was played by Russia's, not always smooth, but still close relations with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait. And what we've seen after the beginning of the war, that this importance only increased because Russia is extremely interested in keeping up the high level of prices, or at least preventing these prices from falling down to be able to fund its military adventures in Ukraine. At the same time, the region keeps on being important for selected Russia's industries, and moreover, this importance even growing. So Moscow is definitely increasing its presence in the agricultural market of the Middle East, which on the top of the financial incomes even creates an additional political leverages of influence for Moscow when your country is dependent on Russian grain or on Russian oil seeds supplies, like for instance in the case of Egypt. Of course, you'll think twice before saying something against Moscow. But at the same time, we also see new dimensions of economic interaction emerged. First of all, the region, and specifically the Persian Gulf region, acquired substantial importance in terms of Russia's efforts to fight against sanctions imposed on Moscow. Russia was learning quite well from Iran how to evade sanctions, and Russia is actively exploiting the Middle East also as a channel through which, on the one hand, it can import those products that are technically banned by sanctions, and also as a region where it can sell its oil and petrochemical products, knowing that these products might end up with a high probability at the European market. Secondly, the region definitely increase its importance in terms of as a transport hub for Moscow with the reorientation of its the flow of its goods exported to the Asian market and imported from the Asian market, we see that one of the main topics that was discussed immediately after the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, March 2022 was the topic of the revitalization of North-South transport corridor. And now it started finally serving its needs. Enough to say that, for instance, the majority of Russia's trade with the UAE is facilitated by these transport corridors. And finally, we should not forget about such thing like military cooperation. Iran turned out to be an important supplier of quite a number of equipment to the Russian army. And first and foremost, its drones that help to change the situation on the front line to a certain extent. But also Russia hopes that after the end of this war, it will be able to resume its presence in the military market of the region. And that's why it continues taking participation in different military exhibitions that are taking part in the region. And some experts are saying that actually its chances to increase its presence in this area are also high. So all in all, we see that basically the basket of economic interests that usually was considered of secondary importance in the pre-war period actually acquired great importance, and now we can say that it's not, if not the main driver of Russia's relations with the Middle East, but at least one of the most important.
Thank you, Nikolay. Over to Tobias now for the, let's say, opposite perspective. So 2 years after the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how is Russia, according to your view, perceived in the Middle East and North Africa region?
Yeah, thanks, Chiara, and thank you to Hannah and Nikolay for those excellent initial remarks. Look, I think it's a mixed picture in terms of how Russia is being perceived in the region. I think, with the exception of perhaps the Assad regime in Syria and Iran, Russia is no one's preferred partner, right? There's not a whole lot of love lost, I would argue. That said, I think almost every country in the Middle East sees a value in engaging with Russia, and sees opportunities in engaging with Russia. In some occasions, that engagement is strategic. So, you know, from the Saudi perspective, for example, engaging with Russia, especially in the sort of framework of OPEC Plus, is clearly a very strategic issue. And for the other members of OPEC, it is too. And sometimes it's opportunistic, right? In terms of take the Egyptian decision to, or sort of collaboration with Russia on a nuclear reactor on the Mediterranean. You know, Russia was there willing to share what is regarded as sort of a very advanced technology in a way that perhaps Western governments were not willing to. So, you know, I think that sort of relatively transactional nature of most relationships has to be highlighted. I think there have been, over the last 2 years, and I'll come to the last sort of 4 months or so in a second, but over the last 2 years, i.e. since the re-invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I think there has been sort of there have been some pluses and minuses for Russia and the way it's being perceived in the region. On the one hand, I think there is sort of a bit of a perception and a bit of a waking up to Russia's military capabilities and them not working out as sort of strong and overwhelming and as many had expected. So I think perhaps some of the shine of Russia as a great military power may have come off. But that is very much sort of I think perhaps also just a sort of a momentary thing. It could well change depending on how the cause of the war goes. But yeah, I think when you look at questions around, you know, the attractiveness of Russian military equipment to militaries in the region, I think that there are a couple of question marks. Certainly, they were there before. You know, Panzer systems and the way they were vulnerable to Turkish drones, in particular in Libya in 2019 and 2020, also played a key role there. But still, I think that is something to look at. On the other hand, Russia, I think, also benefited in terms of its perception in the region and how it was perceived in the region from a slightly more geopolitical, like a wider issue, which, global changes of power, a perception that the United States is reprioritizing other areas, or that the Middle East is deprioritized within that, that China is on the rise, that we're moving towards a more sort of competitive global environment. I think Middle Eastern states across the board are deeply worried about anything like a bipolar international order coming about. And if you are worried about, a sort of world in which one pole is China, one pole is the United States, then, a multipolar order in which an actor like Russia can still be regarded perhaps as a pole, and then you can add other poles too, is quite useful in bringing about a multipolar order, I think, which is everyone's preference in the region. Final point, and I know we want to move on to the Palestinian question in a second. I do think that over the last that basically the conflict in Israel and Gaza has been a gift to Russia when it comes to the Middle East. It's been look, I don't buy this whole notion that Russia is somehow, on the side of the Palestinians and the Arabs against this great injustice and all of that. I simply don't buy it. I think it's purely opportunistic. Relations between Russia and Israel are perfectly fine, but it's great. And sometimes your narrative doesn't have to be true to be successful. And I think Russia's narrative of this sort of double standard West, a distraction from what should be global outrage or what Russia is doing in Ukraine, all of that is just a gift for Russia, and I think it's benefited from that significantly.
Thanks, Tobias. Thank you. You raised many points. I agree that Russia is no one's preferred partner in the region, but they do cooperate with Russia because they prefer to have Russia in the picture alongside many other foreign players than not having Russia in the picture. So you are raising the issue of the Gaza war and the Palestinian issue. So let's now try to focus a bit more on the events that will most likely be held tomorrow in Moscow. So this Interp-Palestinian meeting we were referring to at the beginning. NIKOLAY, I would start with you this time. What are Moscow's motivation for hosting this meeting? I mean, Moscow's motivation behind the desire to help Palestinians unite politically. What Russia does really want. Over to you.
Well, I think that the Palestinian interests here are playing the last role in Moscow's calculations, and I would definitely agree with Tobias that the region perception of Russia is extremely pragmatic and instrumental, but it works in both ways. Moscow considers what's happening in Gaza and Israeli-Palestine relations as something that serves its needs. First of all, in the field of internal and external propaganda. For domestic audience, Russia would definitely like to use this meeting as a kind of case to show that, look, we are not isolated. We are capable to deal with a lot of issues about of Ukraine, and different international forces are ready to come to Moscow once we call them. For international community, it's definitely a signal that Russia is ready to manage several issues at a time, while being concentrated on definitely on Putin's war in Ukraine, but still. And moreover, it's also a warning to those experts, analysts, policymakers who were saying that Moscow will have to withdraw from the Middle East after the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Finally, it's also a message to the Middle East that as opposed to the Eastern countries that are largely supporting, or at least believed to support Israel. Moscow is close to its Arab friends, and it's not going to abandon them. Though, as I mentioned, the interests of the Arab community and Palestinian community here is playing the last role. Finally, there is also a kind of a practical calculation, or the calculations. One, Russia is trying also to build up an alternative processes, negotiation processes that's happening right now on other platforms. And also Moscow sees that right now the international community is discussing the future format of Palestine, or relations within inter-Palestinian relations after the end of the hot phase of the war, or the conflict. And of course, Russia would like to offer its own vision, and to make sure that in the post-conflict period, there will be a stand for Moscow and for its interests in Palestine and in this region. And the stand, of course, will be used for the Russia's interests, maybe to put certain pressure on Israel, maybe to show to the international community that it needs to talk to Russia. But definitely what we can say that these meetings serves extremely pragmatic Russian calculations.
Nikolay, do you think this is also if not direct, maybe indirect message to Netanyahu's government somehow?
Yes.
I mean, would this or I rephrase, would the meeting, you think, compromise relations between, in the Moscow-Tel Aviv axis?
I would say that it's also the way to remind Tel Aviv that Russia still has something to say in this conflict. We've seen that these relations were deteriorating, and moreover, there was a growing dissatisfaction with each other on both sides. Obviously, both sides are gradually, slowly rising the stakes in this game, and I guess it's also Moscow response that, look, if you don't want to deal with us, if you keep on doing what we don't want in Ukraine, we have the leverage to do something in your options to do something in your backyard as well.
Yep. Thank you, very clear. Tobias, over to you. So the meeting is going to happen tomorrow, provided that we still don't know how many factions, how many Palestinian factions and groups will effectively attend, if they will attend. But in any case, why are the Palestinians entrusting Moscow with this? I mean, do you think the keys somehow for Palestinian unity are really to be found in Moscow? Why are they seeking out for Moscow's help?
Right. I mean, no, I don't think the keys to Palestinian unity are found in Moscow. I think they're found amongst the Palestinian groups, and they have to come together. And I think, look, at the moment, I don't think there's anyone else willing to host a meeting like this, right? The notion that there has to be some form of political process on the Palestinian side, if we ever get to a political process between Israel and the Palestinians, is very clear, right? Palestinian politics are deeply divided. Palestinian leadership is effectively non-existent. So, you know, it's a necessary process. In my view, the problem is that at the moment you have no one else willing to sort of step in and to be the sort of external facilitator of that process. And I think, you know, I think Western states at the moment simply have, obviously, primarily through their positioning in the conflict, taken themselves out of that role. I think quite a lot of Middle Eastern countries do not want to essentially use their political capital for something as difficult as this. You know, many countries, I think, across the region still would argue, you know, maybe we're certainly not going to host something that includes Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or we certainly don't think that Hamas can have a future in Palestinian politics, and so on and so on, right? I think everyone else would come with additional preconditions. Russia just has the luxury that it doesn't have to, because it's not going to be a significant player in any real solution. And so I regard this more as a form of political theater. look, a couple of years ago, a very senior Russian policymaker told me answering the question of whether, we'd just discussed how terrible everything was in the Middle East, and I asked him, could you see the light at the end of the tunnel? And he said, well, I can see the light, but I can't see the tunnel, which sounded funny to me. But then also I think what it means is, Russia doesn't see the need for it to build that tunnel, right? Russia doesn't need to offer any solutions. Russia is not in the game of solving conflicts, of resolving any issues. And I think NIKOLAY explained that really well in terms of, the last thing that really matters in all of this is what the Palestinians think, what their interests are. This is a great way for Russia to present itself as, a great power that matters. Whatever is going to be the outcome of a meeting like this in Moscow, I suspect is going to have very little effect on the ground in the Palestinian territories or any significant implications for the conflict itself. But that's not what this meeting is about. So again, I think we're sort of going back to my perhaps slightly cynical view, but still, that I think Russia is primarily a sort of opportunistic actor that sees in hosting a meeting like this a great opportunity to, feed this narrative of Russia as the great, partner of the Arab people and Arab countries in this current conflict without actually having to do that much.
Thank you, Tobias. Very much agree. Hanna, do you agree with this view that of Tobias? I mean, is there any possible mediation role at all for Moscow in this Israel-Palestine crisis? And how does, according to you, the international community sees the hosting of this meeting tomorrow?
Yeah, thanks, Chiara. I mean, I think I largely agree with what I just heard from NIKOLAY and Tobias. If you ask me about the reception of the international community, I don't see the international community or regional countries, for that matter, paying a whole lot of attention to the fact that this meeting is happening over the coming days. I think what you hear in the region is states in the Gulf, certainly, perhaps Egypt, in principle, as a matter of rhetoric, welcoming a greater role for both Russia and China in regional diplomacy writ large. But when it actually comes to the specifics of diplomacy as regards the current situation in Gaza, I think everyone is still looking towards Washington as the main external actor with leverage and with skin in the game, and as an actor who can actually do something. Of course, there's a lot of frustration with the United States. It's perceived as one-sided in this conflict. There is a general sense that the US is also no longer as reliable of an ally as it once was. So there are a host of grievances and concerns that are sort of, reiterated vis-a-vis the United States. And in that context, there's a sort of looking towards Russia and China, but not anything concrete. So I haven't heard anyone express great expectations for the Moscow meeting. My own expectations are also fairly low, in line with what Tobias just said. Let me just add a few more points here. I think, the Russians have hosted intra-Palestinian meetings several times in the past. I believe the last such meeting was in the spring of 2019, when different Palestinian factions came to Moscow. Not much came of that effort then, because I think they were supposed to sign a joint declaration, and in the end, Islamic Jihad and Hamas refused to do so, which also suggests something about Russia's leverage over those groups. Let's not forget that the Russians don't bring a lot of economic incentives to the table when it comes to Gaza and the Palestinians. My understanding is that the meeting that is going to happen over coming days isn't, it's not hosted at the highest level of the Russian government. Let's not forget this. We have Deputy Foreign Minister Bogdanov being in the lead. I think the Oriental Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences might again be involved, as it was in the past. But if you compare that to American diplomacy, which is really sending their most senior people to the region, this is happening at a different level in Moscow. I think even if Moscow was able to get something out of those discussions with the Palestinians the next few days, it would then still beg the question of how this could resonate in a broader diplomatic effort, because the Israelis have made very clear that they're not going to deal with a Palestinian entity that has any sort of traces or remnants of Hamas or Islamic Jihad in it. So there's still sort of the broader question of how you could run with any output from that meeting. And of course, in terms of playing a broader role in mediation, I think the Russians have sidelined themselves, at least as far as Israel is concerned, by taking this very cynical, instrumental, pro-Palestinian posturing in the current crisis.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks very much. I very much agree with that. What you were saying, that this meeting is not being discussed that much at the international level. It's not really hitting the headlines of the international newspapers, and probably that says a lot on what are the real expectations on the meeting itself, at least among Western countries, let's say. Now, before gathering some questions from the audience, I would ask you a very brief reflection on some of the particularly important in the past 2 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Tobias, one of these is certainly the Gulf region. So what do Russia-Gulf relations look like today? A few countries have become increasingly important for Russia. Saudi Arabia, not that it was not before, but the agreement with the OPEC Plus, etc., etc. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. 2 minutes into Russia-Gulf relations. Over to you.
Well, I think, in many ways, actually, NIKOLAY answered quite a lot of this in his sort of first few comments, which, the relationship is at a strategic level when it comes to oil and OPEC Plus. There is really a significant degree of interdependence. The two, especially led by Saudi Arabia on the one side and Russia on the other, OPEC and the Plus, if you will, have come together in order to have a more significant impact on oil prices, especially at a moment when oil prices, well, remember they came together in 2016, so at a moment when oil prices were really not in a good place. So, and they're now quite volatile and have been in a time in between. So, that is a strategic issue, especially for countries that are still so dependent on where oil prices are. However, but below that sort of strategic level, I think it's deeply transactional and it's highly opportunistic. I don't think there are any relationships necessarily being formed that couldn't, if absolute need be sort of wound back very, very quickly. Even the expanded trade relationship between countries like the UAE and Russia, I think, could be, if they had to be wound back quite quickly. So again, I don't see them as particularly strategic at this point. But nevertheless, they matter. But why does Russia want to be involved in the Gulf? It's the same reason why countries like the UK or pretty much every other European country, when they think about the Middle East, and the only part of the region really where they think about opportunities and great opportunities, especially in the economic realm, is the Gulf. And the same is going to be true for Russia too. A dynamic place, a source of investment, and so on. So I think all of that matters. Of course, from Russia's perspective, also matters that is sort of regarded as the West's closest partners. So if you can show that, even the West's closest partners in the region are not just, willing to follow the line given by Washington, then that again feeds that sort of narrative that Russia loves to promote across the region.
Thank you, Tobias. Hanna, building on what Tobias was saying, so the reason why Russia wants to cooperate with Gulf countries is the same reason why other countries want to cooperate with Gulf countries. Maybe the case of Iran is different. So what is really behind the Russia-Iran partnership? This is one of the bilateral relation that has grown the most over the past 2 years, also in terms of military cooperation. Do you see the Russia-Iran partnership growing in the nearest future?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. I'll try to be quick in the interest of time. But, I belong to those who would argue that at this stage, the Russia-Iran relationship is not merely a transactional relationship anymore. It has really deepened and widened considerably, I think, over the last 2 years. NIKOLAY has already mentioned the military support that Russia is getting from Iran with the Shahed drones, ammunition. More recently, reports that ballistic missiles have been sent, though I'm yet to see evidence that those have actually made it to the battlefield in Ukraine. So I think we need to wait and see. But certainly that support has been material for Russia. And there's a concern over the military support that Russia could give Iran in return. I think there's been a lot of talk over conventional systems like the Sukhoi 35. And again, we're yet to see that support materializing. But it is not just on the defense side that the relationship is deepening. It's also the fact that I think, Iran becoming part of the enlarged BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, widening its cooperation with Central Asian countries. These are all things I would say would have been difficult if Russia had stood in the way. So certainly Russia is enabling Iran in doing that. And a final point I'd like to make here, which I think is perhaps most concerning, is again on the nuclear dossier, where we're in a situation where Iran is now considered a nuclear threshold state, a near-nuclear state. We have abandoned efforts to return to the JCPOA for all intents and purposes since fall of 2022. Those efforts have effectively been halted for various reasons that we can't go into. And we don't have a good answer now how to deal with that kind of situation. And Russia has emerged again as a player that is deprioritizing nuclear non-proliferation, that has not helped efforts to deal with this issue. And I think will continue to shield Iran diplomatically on the question of the nuclear issue in the future. And perhaps final point, which also we cannot go into, but I think there's also a change in Russia's relations with the axis of resistance or Iran-backed groups more broadly in the region, where Russia has also stepped up the game, shielding some of those groups diplomatically, whether it's Hamas or the Houthis, and perhaps also colluding a bit more with them militarily, logistically, even though we're not seeing sort of systematic security assistance by the Russian Federation to those groups. But I do think there's a sort of a desire to egg on the axis of resistance, because it is an axis that is trying to push the United States out of the Middle East.
Of course. Anna, I would say with you a couple of seconds, because there is a question from the audience which is somehow related to what you just discussed. So I'm reading, there are rumors that Russia and Iran are developing joint production projects. Is that true? I think this may be referred to the joint drone production project in Tatarstan, maybe. It's not specified, but do you feel like answering?
It's referred to the drone technology. I think absolutely that's been reported on for a while, that Russia is indigenizing production of various models of the Shahed drone with Iranian support. I think that project has proceeded, and that has been documented in the open source. But I think beyond that, probably there's a lot of knowledge diffusion happening between the strategic communities of Russia and Iran behind the scenes, things that are difficult to study or get knowledge of. But I think that's probably happening. I mean, let's not forget that Russia and Iran have also signed joint declarations of intent to withstand Western sanctions and punitive measures. So there's probably a lot of knowledge exchange about how you deal with your defense industry in light of sanctions and export controls, how you circumvent some of those punitive measures. So I think there's probably a lot going on behind the scenes.
Thanks, Anna, for answering. NIKOLAY, over to you. So we explore Russia-Gulf relations, Russia-Iran relations. Syria, maybe in all these scenarios, looks a bit marginal, but it actually remains one of the main dossiers of Russia's Middle East and North Africa policy, and a crown jewel of Moscow's at least military projection into the Middle East. How is Russia-Syria partnership evolving at the moment?
Well, I would say that we are talking right now about certain stalemate. That Russia right now cannot afford to get militarily involved in this issue as deep as it used to be, and as it was mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, HANNA at the very beginning of our discussion, we saw certain decrease in Russian military presence on the ground, and certain areas were given to the Iranians. Yet at the same time, the question of Syrian reconstruction, Syrian reintegration remains open. And I would say that we see actually the emphasis is moving away from maybe military aspect to aspect of the political and diplomatic relations, but it also means actually nothing good for Russia. Yes, it's present there, it has this leverage, but at the same time, it doesn't have enough efficient leverages to persuade the international community to do what it wants, to channel money for the reconstruction of the Syrian regime. Moreover, those successes that it achieved with the recognition of Assad regime in the Arab world, they didn't bring much. And if we see, for instance, the certain legislation being adopted in the US, the question of, with regard to the Caesar law and the improvement of the efficiency of its implementation, actually all these economic political processes, they might be put on hold. Meanwhile, economic situation in Syria itself is deteriorating, creating quite an unstable situation in the zones that are either formally or physically under the regime control. And that might become another challenge for Russia in the long run. What if we see another round of destabilization, and what Russia can do? So I would say that actually Syria is not a gift for Russia, it's not a jewel for Russia, rather than a serious headache in the long run. And I'm not sure that Moscow is prepared to act accordingly to respond to this challenge in future.
Thank you, Nikolay. I think we're running over time, but it's okay because our audience has been quite shy and the only question was for Hannah. So I think we can conclude this event for today. I want to very much thank you, our speakers, TOBIAS, BORCK, NIKOLAY, KOZHANOV, and HANNA NOTTE, for their excellent participation and the insights that they gave to us, and looking forward to the next occasion to be together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.